The forest was too quiet. Sergeant Ethan Kross had been in war zones all over the world, but this place, it felt different. The kind of different that prickled at the back of your neck and made your pulse thrum in your ears. He'd been dropped a mile out from the target, a remote NATO research facility buried deep in the mountains. As he moved through the dense tree line, the leaves were unnaturally still, like they'd frozen mid-breath. No wind, no animals, not even the distant hum of insects. Just dead silence. The only sound was the crunch of his boots in the undergrowth. Focus, Kross. The briefing had been vague. Too vague for his liking. Communications lost. Strange sightings reported. No further intel. A standard recon mission, they said. Except that something had already gone horribly wrong. The moment he stepped onto the forest floor, the scent of blood hit him, thick and coppery. Kross crouched down, his gloved fingers brushing the dried streaks smeared across the bark of a nearby tree. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. His breath came out in misty clouds as dusk began to settle in, draping the forest in a suffocating twilight. The facility loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the bleeding sky. From the outside, it looked like a bunker, half buried in the earth, reinforced steel doors hanging off their hinges like a gaping wound in the ground. Kross tightened his grip on his rifle and advanced, his steps cautious, deliberate. As he approached the entrance, his boots crunched on something slick. He looked down and felt his stomach knot, thick pools of blood, still wet, glistening under the fading light. The metallic scent was stronger now, clawing its way up his nostrils. He forced himself to move forward. Inside, the facility was a graveyard. The first thing he saw was the blood. Everywhere. Painted across the walls, pooling on the floor, sprayed in streaks across overturned desks and broken lab equipment. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, barely illuminating the carnage. His boots squelched in the viscera as he stepped over a body. No, what was left of a body. It had been torn apart, limbs shredded like paper, organs scattered like someone had thrown them in a rage. Whoever, or whatever, did this wasn't human. The gouges were too deep, the savagery too raw. The silence was deafening. No cries, no moans of the dying. Just the faint buzz of the failing lights, the drip of something thick and wet, echoing off the steel walls. Kross crouched by one of the corpses, his eyes narrowing at the claw marks raked across the chest, deep enough to expose bone. He ran a hand through his hair, slick with sweat despite the cold. A low growl echoed from deep within the facility, barely audible, but enough to freeze the blood in his veins. He stood slowly, every muscle tight, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway ahead. There was movement, just a flicker, something shifting in the corner of his vision. He raised his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger, but there was nothing. Only darkness and the smell of rot. He moved forward, his every step deliberate. His flashlight cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to twist around the beam, like they were alive, retreating only to regroup just beyond his reach. His breath quickened. Each step echoed in the silence, louder than it should have been. His eyes caught something shiny on the floor. A trail of blood leading deeper into the belly of the facility. Drag marks. Something had been pulled, its body scraping against the floor, leaving streaks of crimson behind. The growl came again, closer now. More guttural. Hungry. Kross swallowed hard. Stay calm. The lights flickered again, and for the briefest moment, he saw it. Glowing eyes in the darkness. Large. Predatory. And gone as fast as they appeared. A chill rippled down his spine. His grip tightened on the rifle, heart pounding in his chest, threatening to crack his ribs. Then, a noise, squelching. Something wet being torn apart, flesh ripping from bone. Kross's flashlight beam snapped toward the sound, catching the glint of metal and red. A body, one of the soldiers, was being dragged down the hallway. The man's face was frozen in a silent scream, his lifeless eyes staring into nothing. But it wasn't the body that made Kross's stomach churn. It was the thing dragging it. The figure was barely human, its silhouette hunched, limbs far too long, muscles rippling beneath a coat of thick, dark fur. Claws, huge, jagged claws, dug into the body like hooks. Blood dripped from its maw, pooling beneath it, and those eyes, those glowing amber eyes, locked onto Kross as it let the body drop with a wet thud. Time seemed to stop. Kross barely registered the creature's speed until it lunged. It was on him in seconds, faster than any animal he'd ever encountered, a blur of fur, teeth, and claws. Kross fired a burst, but the thing was already moving. It hit him with the force of a truck, sending him crashing into the wall. Pain exploded through his chest, sharp and blinding. He gasped as claws tore through his vest, cutting deep into the flesh beneath. Blood poured from his side, warm and slick, soaking his uniform. The creature roared, a deep primal sound that reverberated through the walls, vibrating in his bones. Its breath was hot, rancid, a mix of blood and decay. Kross struggled, kicking at it, trying to shove the beast off, but it was too strong, too fast. The claws raked across his arm, tearing through muscle and tendon like paper. Blood sprayed across the floor, splattering the walls as the creature snarled, teeth flashing in the dim light. Kross managed to throw himself backward, stumbling away from the beast. His vision blurred, blood pouring from the gashes in his chest and arm. He tried to raise his rifle, but the creature was already gone, disappearing into the shadows with the same unsettling speed. His ragged breath echoed in the silence. Blood dripped from his wounds, pooling beneath him, a reminder that this was no ordinary mission. This was a slaughterhouse, and he was the next on the menu. In the distance, the low growl rumbled again, this time closer, and Kross realized, with a sickening dread, that this wasn't just a hunt. It was a game, and he was losing. Kross moved deeper into the facility, his breath coming in ragged bursts, each step slow and deliberate. His flashlight flickered in the oppressive dark, casting long, distorted shadows along the blood-smeared walls. The air was thick with the scent of iron and death, and the silence pressed down on him, broken only by the distant hum of flickering lights and the occasional crackle of failing electronics. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn back, but he pressed on, gripping his rifle so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The low growl came again, rumbling from somewhere deep within the building. Closer this time, more deliberate. Kross froze, heart hammering in his chest. His eyes scanned the darkness, every muscle in his body tense, ready to spring. The sound of something large moving, shifting, reached his ears, a scraping, like claws dragging across the concrete floor. His breath caught in his throat, and then it hit, so fast he barely registered the blur of movement. A massive shape lunged from the shadows, crashing into him with bone-shattering force. Kross barely had time to raise his weapon before the creature was on him. Claws raking across his chest, tearing through his vest like it was paper. He gasped in pain. The breath knocked from his lungs as the impact slammed him into the wall. His flashlight clattered to the floor, the beam spinning wildly, casting disorienting flashes of light and shadow across the carnage. The creature was fast, faster than anything he'd ever faced. It moved like a shadow, a blur of fur and claws, teeth bared in a savage snarl. Kross fired wildly, bullets ricocheting off the walls, but the beast was already gone, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Kross struggled to his feet, blood pouring from the deep gashes in his chest. His breath came in sharp, painful gasps, each one a reminder of how close he'd come to being torn apart. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling the warm, sticky flow of blood soak through his fingers. The pain was excruciating, but there was no time to dwell on it. The creature wasn't finished with him yet. He stumbled forward, his flashlight beam weak and wavering, barely cutting through the dark. Every step felt like it could be his last. The facility had become a nightmare, a labyrinth of blood and shadows, with death lurking around every corner. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. There was another growl, closer, louder. It echoed through the halls, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Kross's pulse quickened. He spun, rifle raised, but saw nothing. Just empty corridors, slick with gore, the flickering lights casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. His nerves were fraying, his mind racing. Was it toying with him? Was this some twisted game, a predator savoring the fear of its prey? The growl came again, followed by the wet sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Kross's stomach lurched. The beam of his flashlight caught the glint of blood-soaked metal just ahead. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. There, at the end of the corridor, a soldier's body, one of the facility's guards, was being pulled into the shadows. Kross's heart skipped a beat as he saw it, the massive shape dragging the lifeless corpse with ease, claws hooked into the body's flesh, blood oozing in thick streams behind it. The creature was barely visible in the dim light, hulking, covered in matted fur, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It paused, turning its head toward Kross. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and the beast let out a low, rumbling snarl. Blood dripped from its jaws, pooling at its feet. Kross's blood ran cold. The thing dropped the body and lunged at him again, faster than his eyes could follow. He didn't even have time to scream. The creature moved faster than Kross could register. One moment, it was dragging the body through the blood-slicked corridor, and the next, it was on him again. Huge, hulking, a blur of fur and claws. Kross fired, but the bullets were useless. The rounds hit the creature's side, but it barely flinched, as if the impact was little more than an annoyance. It slammed into him with bone-shattering force, sending him crashing into a wall. His rifle clattered to the ground, forgotten. Pain exploded through his chest and ribs. The air knocked from his lungs. He gasped, trying to get his bearings, but the creature didn't give him time. Its claws raked across his torso, tearing through flesh and muscle, leaving deep, bloody gashes. Blood poured from his wounds, warm and slick, soaking through his gear and pooling on the floor beneath him. Kross's vision blurred as the pain seared through him, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. He pushed himself up, stumbling backward, one hand pressed against his torn side, the other fumbling for his sidearm. The creature snarled, baring its teeth, yellow and slick with fresh blood. Kross fired again, emptying the magazine into the beast at point-blank range, but it was like trying to stop a hurricane with a stone. The werewolf staggered, but only for a moment. Its amber eyes gleamed in the dim light, filled with an animal rage and hunger that chilled him to the core. It lunged again, swiping at him with its massive claws. The force of the blow sent him spinning across the room, crashing into a desk that shattered under his weight. His body screamed in agony, blood streaming from his chest, arms, and face. Every breath was a struggle, his lungs burning, his heart pounding in his ears. Kross's mind raced, but there was no strategy that would save him now. No weapons left, no backup, no escape. The creature was relentless, unstoppable. It didn't just want to kill him, it was savoring the hunt, dragging it out, enjoying every moment of his suffering. He managed to crawl backward, his hands slipping on the blood-slick floor as the werewolf stalked toward him, its heavy footfalls echoing in the narrow hallway. The beast was covered in gore, its matted fur glistening in the pale light. Each step was slow, deliberate. It was toying with him, drawing out the final moments. Kross reached for anything that could help. His hands brushed against a piece of shattered metal from the broken desk. Desperation clawed at him, and he grabbed it, thrusting it forward as the creature closed in. The jagged shard pierced the werewolf's side, sinking deep into its flesh. The werewolf let out a howl of pain, staggering backward for the first time. Blood oozed from the wound, dark and thick, but Kross knew it wouldn't be enough. The creature snarled, yanking the metal from its side as if it were nothing more than a splinter. Its amber eyes burned with rage, and it lunged again, its claws slashing across Kross's side, opening him up like a piece of meat. The pain was excruciating. Blood sprayed across the room, splattering the walls, the floor, his gear, everything soaked in the crimson tide. Kross could barely keep his eyes open, his body failing, his vision going dark at the edges. He was losing blood too fast. The creature stood over him now, its chest heaving with each breath, saliva dripping from its maw, thick and ropey. Kross could feel its hot breath on his skin, rancid with the smell of decay and death. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The werewolf lowered itself over him, its claws sinking into his shoulders, pinning him to the ground. Kross's breathing was shallow, ragged. He couldn't fight anymore. His body was broken, bleeding out, his strength gone. The werewolf leaned in closer, its snarl low and guttural, teeth bared, dripping with saliva and blood. Kross stared up at it, his heart pounding, knowing this was the end. The creature's jaws snapped shut around his neck, and everything went black.